raise your glass up high. Turn it up, it's time. Tall boy on the line. Loud breeze, they will last. Raise your glass up high.
Welcome back to episode 320 of the Tall Boy Radio podcast. And as we always say, who knows where it goes when the beer flows? Well, before we say hello to our guest tonight, I want to say another hello, and that is to country number 85, Armenia, and country number 86, Egypt. 86 countries. I know Gaz is going to be very, very excited when he gets back from the Czech Republic, where he is at the moment. Unfortunately, they're already listening in, so we can't add an 87th country by getting him to listen there. Anyway, tonight I am joined by an author and a journalist. I have his book here in my hand, if you can see it there, the CBGB Conspiracy, and we're going to be talking about that tonight, amongst other things. Is it Gabriel or Gabe? How should I say your name?
Gabe is fine.
Great. Did you want to say hello and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, hello, and first of all, thank you for having me on. I love this this show. Yeah, I am a writer and musician and television producer. Lived in New York City for 25 years and then Los Angeles for 25 years, and have recently relocated back to the East Coast. And in the 70s, I was a musician working on the downtown New York scene, centered around CBGBs and Max's Kansas City. And I decided to write a novel, a mystery novel, based upon my experiences there. The novel is fictional, but the characters in it are mostly real people who I knew on that scene in the 1970s. And yeah, that's what it is.
I mean, that's a great concept, isn't it? You know, when we've done a number of episodes where we've had officers on from New York City, and in fact, we got in contact off of the back of one of those episodes where we talked about the blackouts in the 1970s. And one of the things that we generally find is, you know, we love, and our listeners love hearing about that time, because the demographic I think that we appeal to is similar to ages to ourselves, and that's the New York City that we grew up looking over to. You know, it looked like the wild frontier almost. It looked exciting. Is that how it was?
Well, it was incredibly exciting if you were young, but what people our age remember is that in the 1970s, New York City was literally melting down. It had gone bankrupt. It had lost 1 million people had moved out of the city because it was so dysfunctional. Crime was through the roof. There were an average of 6 murders a day in New York City in the 70s, and most of them went unsolved. The garbage, the graffiti, the abandoned buildings, the burning neighborhoods were just a world apart from what New York is like now. New York completely recovered starting in the 80s and then went into a boom, and now it's largely considered, at least Manhattan is considered to be the province of millionaires. You basically have to be extremely wealthy to live in Manhattan. But in those days, because so many people were leaving the city and it was so dysfunctional, you could move to New York and get an apartment for $100 a month downtown in Manhattan. That same apartment today would cost $3,000 or $4,000 a month if you could get it. But in those days, you could just move there. So it became a magnet for young people that wanted to be in the music business. They wanted to be writers, wanted to be artists, poets, whatever you wanted to do. You could move to New York, and on the salary that you would make being a bicycle messenger or working in a bookshop or something like that, you could live in Manhattan. And a scene evolved around the downtown world. For people that know New York, downtown is basically below 14th Street, from Soho up to about 14th Street. It's really only about 1 square mile, the downtown world of New York. And pretty much everybody that you knew lived in that 1 square mile. All the clubs and restaurants and things that you went to were in that 1 square mile. And it had that, because of the close proximity, everybody kind of knew each other, which sounds crazy to say in a city as big as New York that everybody knew each other. But you would walk out your door and walk around and bump into people that you knew everywhere you went, and everyone would go to the same clubs and the same restaurants. And so there was that kind of artistic, cultural mixing where people influenced each other, and scenes developed that started out as local scenes, but then became huge national and international movements. I'm thinking of things like the earlier in the 60s, the folk music scene around Greenwich Village, which is part of downtown, which produced people like Bob Dylan and Joni Mitchell and people like that. And then the glam rock scene, the New York Dolls and all of that, which was so influential. And then when I got to New York in 1974, the very beginning of the punk movement, which evolved around CBGBs in Max's Kansas City. And they were all in that same area. Everybody knew everybody else. And it created a cultural vibe that I'm afraid these days is very hard to reproduce when things are so expensive and people live scattered all over the place and are trying to create a sort of a culture on the internet by interconnecting with people on the internet. You can do that, and if that's the best that you can do, it works to an extent, but there's no substitution for the actual physical proximity of people hanging out with each other, getting high with each other, having sex with each other, making music with each other, etc. And that's what we had then.
That's it. And you described the sort of the devastation financially of New York in that time period, and it was the same in the UK at that time. We'd coming off the back of some very unsuccessful Labour governments who'd made some disastrous policies, and the economy absolutely tanked, affected different parts of the country in different ways. But even in London, which is a fairly wealthy part of our country, things were quite devastating. And it was the punk movement that grew off the back of that here as well, the likes of the Sex Pistols, which would not have existed in any other time frame. When people talk about punk music nowadays and they talk about things like Green Day, it's got a punk sound to it, but that isn't punk music for me. It's the music that came from that time frame, that came from that level of frustration, that you can actually hear emotion, and that's what it was about. It was about people's frustration and emotion with everything that was happening in the world. And their worlds were, very small in many ways, because, we weren't really aware of everything that went on around us. And I imagine that was the same in 70s New York as well. And I love the New York Dolls. I think they're fantastic. I love Blondie. That was the first music I really started listening to as a kid. I'm in my 50s now. We'll leave it at that. But yeah, I grew up listening to Blondie. So, and that sort of their early stuff, before they sort of segued into the disco stuff, was sort of very punk. That's where their origins were, wasn't it?
It was. That was Blondie, Patti Smith, Talking Heads, the Ramones, Television, Tom Verlaine and Television. There were a number of bands. But the thing that's interesting to me about the name punk is that I think that most people associate it, and rightly so to an extent, with sort of like the Sex Pistols and the Ramones. It's sort of a loud, sort of protesty music, very, very simple, 2 chords, 3 chords, banging on the guitars, people that don't necessarily play their instruments terribly well because they just don't really need to, playing music that simple, and so it's loud and raucous. And I think when most people think of punk, that's what they think of. But the original thing that began at CBGB's with people like Patti Smith and Television, Tom Verlaine and Blondie and people like that, Talking Heads, was not really that. Even though it's called punk, and Patti Smith is called the godmother of punk and so on, when you listen to their music, it's really, it's very artistic and very poetic. And in many ways, they were sort of like the equivalent of the beat poetry movement that had happened 15 or 20 years before. They were very intellectual. Patti Smith is very intellectual. Talking Heads, very intellectual. Tom Verlaine. And so there's this weird dichotomy between the name punk encapsulates all of it, but there were 2 distinct strains to me. One was what I called the arty punks, people that were very artistic and oftentimes were art school dropouts, or were people that had originally tried to make their name like Patti Smith did as a published poet. And then there were the raucous Sex Pistols, Ramones kind of punks, and they were all encapsulated, and they were all friends with each other, and they all hung out with each other. You would go to CBGB's on a Tuesday night, and there would be Patti Smith over in the corner talking to Joey Ramone, and David Johansen would be chatting with Alex Chilton, and everybody knew everybody. But there were these two distinct strains.
Oh, yeah. I mean, what was it like being a musician in those times and seeing those characters firsthand? That must have been incredible.
Well, the thing is that they weren't famous then. So when CBs started, CBGBs, for people that don't know the history, it was a man named Hilly Crystal. It was a very good friend of mine. I loved Hilly, and I think everyone who knew him really loved him. He was just a heart of gold kind of person. Had opened a club on the Bowery in 1972, I think, primarily for bluegrass and country music. Now, the Bowery then, and for most of the 20th century, was arguably the most dysfunctional street in the United States, of any place in the United States. It was the place where people had constructed flop houses for alcoholics, where you could rent a bed for 25 cents a night. And in the morning they kicked you out, and you went out on the street and you drank from your paper bag on the street all day. And then at night they would let you back in for 25 cents. So it was just wall to wall, homeless people, alcoholics. We called them Bowery bums. I suppose you wouldn't use that word today. It would be considered a pejorative, but Bowery bum was what that was called. And Hilly opened his club there for bluegrass and country, and nobody came, right? It was like nobody wanted to go to the Bowery, to go to any kind of club on the Bowery. You'd have to be out of your mind, especially at night. So one day he was standing outside on a ladder fixing something on his awning, and these two guys walked up the street. I think it was Richard Hell and Tom Verlaine. And they were walking by. They had started a band, and they didn't have any place to play. It was amazing that in the early 70s, there were very few places for original bands to play in New York City. It had just kind of gone out of fashion. And they looked in, the door was open. They looked in, they saw this club with a big stage in the back and sound system and everything. And they said to Hilly, "Hey, mister, what is this place?" He said, "It's this, bluegrass club." And they said, "Well, we don't play bluegrass music, but would you let us play here?" And Hilly, of course, his club was empty most of the time, said, "Sure, I'll let anybody play here if they want to play." So they started to play, and he gave them a residency. They played, I think, every Thursday, Friday, and Saturday for 6 weeks or something like that. And because they knew and were friends with people like Patti Smith and the Ramones and people like that, who were completely unknown and hadn't even played anywhere yet, their friends began to come to hear them. And this buzz began that there was this crazy club down in the Bowery that you could play in. And so people started to do that. But at the beginning, and that's right when I showed up, because I moved to New York in 74, and this was like late 74. But they were completely unknown. And nobody had heard of them outside of just a couple of square blocks of the East Village, of the downtown scene. So yes, it's true that when you walked in, you would see all of these people who now are legendary hanging out and talking to each other. But then they were not only not legendary, they were completely unknown. And that was one of the things that made it fascinating and fun, was that Hilly gave people the opportunity to hone their craft. Most of the people that I saw at CB's in the beginning, including Blondie, including the Ramones, including Talking Heads, were not very good when they started. Debbie Harry would get up there with Blondie, and you'd go, "Oh, I don't know. I mean, these songs are not so great. And I mean, she's very pretty, but I don't know if she can really sing." But Hilly gave her and them and everybody a chance to keep coming back week after week. And as we say in the musician world, one live performance is worth 1 hour on stage is worth 20 hours in the rehearsal studio. To play live in front of other people is the best kind of rehearsal. And rapidly people got better. And then they started getting good. And the buzz began, and people from the newspapers, the New York Times and the Village Voice, began showing up and talking about this scene that was beginning to happen there. And then record companies began to show up. And starting with Patti Smith, one by one, people got signed to record deals. And then within 5 years, these people were now legendary, and there's this legendary scene. And oh my God, were you actually ever there at CBGB's in those days? But at the time, it was nothing. It was just your friends going to see your friends playing in this little club on the Bowery.
It's incredible. And you know, when you start writing a book, one of the things that people tell you that the way to start writing a book is to write about what you know, and that's where you start your foundation. So to have that as a background, that's pretty inspirational stuff, isn't it, to have as a background for a book?
It absolutely is, and it lends itself to so much. And one thing that people would say to me was, because I had that as a career, but then I also became a journalist, and I was an AIDS activist, and then I became a TV producer. People would say you should write a memoir, particularly of those years. And I really didn't want to do that for a very personal reason, which was that I'm gay, and most of my friends in that era, even people around CBGB's and Max's, were gay. And in the 80s, AIDS happened, and the majority of them died of AIDS. And I did not really feel like I could put myself through the emotional thing of writing a memoir of the 70s and early 80s, knowing what was going to happen to all of these wonderful characters that I would be talking about in the memoir. So one day it just occurred to me, wait a minute, what if I took those characters, took my friends, and simply put them in a fictional story and centered it around one particular time and place in the 70s, long before AIDS reared its ugly head, and just brought them back to life in that way? That would be fun. I could do that, and it would be potentially fun. So that was actually the beginning of the idea of the book.
It's a great way of doing it, to be honest with you. You know, I totally get what you're saying in terms of writing a memoir. Don't get me wrong, I'm sure it would be fascinating to read, but I imagine it would have been quite an ordeal to write, especially like you say, you know, there's so many of those central characters which sadly will have passed away during that time.
Yeah.
So a fictional story would be a much better way to go about things, I imagine. So the people who are in the book that you know, who are still with us, what's their take on it?
I haven't actually heard. There's not that many people that are in it who are still with us. I basically confined the characters, the people who actually have speaking roles, to people that were deceased. So it does mention Blondie, and it does mention Patti Smith. Debbie, Harry, and Chris Stein are still alive. Patti is very much still alive. But they don't actually have speaking parts in the book. They're just sort of in the background. But I was careful to make sure that all of the people that actually have speaking parts and are actual characters in the book are deceased, so that I would be free. And they're all public figures. They're all people that are famous, and so you're allowed to do that. So I eagerly await hearing. I mean, the book's only recently out, so I have not heard from Patti or from Debbie or from anybody who's mentioned. I eagerly want to know what they think about it. But I did confine it to people that were deceased. And the initial, when I was thinking about the story, I was thinking, okay, it's going to be a murder mystery. It's going to take place in 1977, which was the year that New York City hit rock bottom. It was the year of the Great Blackout, which you guys have talked about on the show. It was the year that New York went bankrupt. It was the year of the son of Sam, the notorious serial killer, etc. I thought, what kind of a story could I come up with that would include all these people? And then just one day I was walking my dog, and I suddenly thought of this idea where a young man is found dead in his apartment, in his tenement apartment in the East Village, with a heroin needle in his arm. And the cops immediately dismiss it as an accidental overdose. But his friends don't believe that it was an accident. They think that he was murdered. And so one of his friends goes to the apartment late at night to look around and see if he can find any evidence of a murder. And when he gets there, someone is coming out of the apartment, and it's William Burroughs, the great beat writer of Junkie and et cetera, William Burroughs. one of the original beats, and he immediately suspects that William Burroughs is the murderer. And that was just the idea. Like, oh wow, that would be really fun to have the main suspect of the book be the guy that wrote Junkie and books like that. So that was the inspiration, and then it just kind of went from there.
Wow. So take yourself back then to the 1970s and the blackouts. First of all, what was that like to experience? And second of all, like I said, we spoke there at the start about where we are here in a very small, insignificant town in Cheshire, South Cheshire in the UK, and nothing really, we don't get a lot of crime here, I'm pleased to report. What was it like living in a city where there's an active serial killer at that time?
Well, about the Son of Sam, the funny thing about the Son of Sam is that he only struck in the outer boroughs of New York, primarily Queens and Brooklyn and the Bronx. He actually, it turns out that when they caught him, David Berkowitz, he lived just outside the Bronx. And so we were kind of and he also, for people that don't remember Son of Sam, what he would do is he would go around in these sort of suburban parts of New York City where young people would park in their cars and make out, like lovers' lanes, and he would shoot them through the windows of their cars. Horrible, using a .44 caliber gun, which will take half of your head off, gigantic caliber bullets. And there were no lovers' lanes in Manhattan where we lived. There was nothing like that. Nobody went parking in their cars in downtown Manhattan. Nobody even had cars in downtown Manhattan. So we were unaffected by it. It was in the newspaper every day, so we were aware of it, but we weren't really worried about it. But people in the outer boroughs were very worried about it, and he was only going after women with certain length and color of their hair. So people were getting their hair cut and dyed different colors. I mean, it was that terrifying. So that was going on. But the general thing that affected us much more was just a general crime. It was funny. My parents are from Connecticut, and they would come into the city every once in a while to visit me in the 70s, take me out to lunch or whatever. And it seemed like practically every time they did, we'd leave my place, we'd be walking down the street, and suddenly gunshots would erupt from somewhere, and you'd hear people screaming and diving behind parked cars or something. And my parents, who were from this bucolic suburban Connecticut, it's like really nice in Connecticut, they just couldn't believe that I lived in a place like that. And people got mugged all the time, and people would come home to their apartments, and the window to the fire escape would be broken, and their TV and their stereo would be missing. So that's the kind of thing that we put up with. But we were, when you're young, I moved there when I was 21. You don't believe that anything bad is ever going to really happen to you. So we just felt invulnerable, and we just kind of, you stayed out of Central Park at night, and you did some obvious things where you didn't put yourself at just obvious risk of being killed. But other than that, we were out every single night running around and just assuming that everything would be fine. The blackout, which happened on the hottest night of July 1977 during an enormous heat wave, and the heat wave just overwhelmed the electrical grid, and lightning struck some transformer somewhere, and the whole city went out, and it was out for about 24 hours. And it happened around 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock at night, on the hottest night when everyone was out on the street already. And because of the dysfunction of New York at that time, people took that as an opportunity to begin looting and basically sort of rioting in the streets and looting. And the police were completely overwhelmed. Fires broke out everywhere. The city just erupted in flames and looting. And that was a wild, wild night, I can tell you. Some really crazy things happened that night. One of the most interesting things, though, to me, from a musical history perspective about that night is that in addition to punk beginning in the mid-70s in New York, hip-hop also began in the mid-70s, also in New York, primarily in the Bronx and Brooklyn. And this involved mostly DJs spinning with two turntables and developing all of the techniques that later became so famous as part of hip-hop. But most of the people that were doing that were very poor, and they were unable to afford the kind of equipment that you would need in order to set yourself up as a hip hop DJ. But when the lights went out, people immediately headed to the electronics stores and smashed the windows and came running out with turntables and speakers and amps and all the stuff that you would need that would normally cost you thousands of dollars that you didn't have because you were poor and you were black and you lived in the Bronx, and where are you ever going to get that money? And suddenly they had that equipment, and that led within weeks to an explosion of talent in the hip hop thing that really gave rise to hip hop. And so hip hop has a direct connection to the blackout in a very visceral way, which is amazing.
That is amazing, when you think about it. Okay, it makes total sense, in an area that was quite deprived, and that equipment ain't cheap, you know what I mean? And and this is just how they happened to it. So what was it like when we had Vernon Gebeth on and you were listening to did it take you back to those nights as he was talking about?
Yes,
his
absolutely.
sort of side?
It took me right back. It was very real, everything that he was saying. So you had that. So those are, so when I was writing the book or thinking of the idea of the book, I was thinking, how could I work the blackout into the plot of the book? How could I work the Son of Sam into the plot of the book? And there was another thing that's much less famous for most people, but for gay people, and particularly gay men of a certain age, my age, it's a very major thing. And that was the Everard bathhouse fire. There was, there were gay bathhouses in the 70s. Probably everyone's heard about those. And the oldest one, the most sort of venerable one, was called the Everard bathhouse. It went back many, many decades. And in the summer of 1977, it burned. There was a fire there. And because it was substandard and the windows were blocked and the doors were blocked and there were no sprinkler systems or whatever, a lot of people died in that fire, including people whose bodies were never identified. Because when you would go into a bathhouse, you would take off your clothes and put on a towel and walk around in a towel. And they just found people like that, dead from smoke inhalation or whatever, that were never identified. And that was a really, really big deal for the gay population of New York. And that also happened. So I was like, how could I work that into the plot of the book? So I juggled all of these things together and decided, and no one ever solved the Everard bathhouse. No one really knows, was it an arson fire? Was it an accident? It has remained mysterious ever since. So I decided that I would solve that crime in the book as part of the plot of the book. So it all came together in this stew. And then again, and all centered around CBGBs and the music scene around CBGBs. And the drug scene around CBGBs too, because there were a lot of drugs in those days, including a lot of heroin, and heroin plays a pretty major part in the plot of the book as well.
Like you say, with the character there found dead at the very beginning. So the Everard bath fire there. So I'll be honest, it's not something I'm hugely familiar with. Was it a case of, was the investigation questioned? Was there a feeling that enough resources weren't put towards it because of the people involved?
Yeah, exactly. It was, and that happened a lot. It happened to gay people, and it happened to people of color, particularly African American people, that your life was significantly devalued by the New York City Police Department. If you were gay, if you were black, if you were a member of a disenfranchised community, they just didn't really care that much. And so more things would go unsolved than solved because of that. And then we found out later in the 1980s when the AIDS epidemic began, and it primarily affected gay men and IV drug users who tended to be people of color, that society, not just the New York City Police Department, but society in general, either didn't care at all or actually thought it was kind of a good thing. hey, there's this new disease that's getting rid of these two very undesirable groups of people. Why look for a cure? Why spend money trying to research what's going on? Why even report about it in the newspaper? Just let it quietly fester. So we really got a lesson in the 80s in how society looked at that, and that led to AIDS activism and all of that. And I think that a lot has changed since then. I don't think that that would happen like that again. But we were not really that aware of it in the 70s. We were aware that we were still being targeted by the police, but we did think that if there was a big fire, they would investigate it, but they didn't really. And they didn't investigate if you died of a drug overdose. That was, it was sort of, it was your own fault was kind of the attitude. So why waste police money on something like that?
Yeah, almost like it was solving a problem for them by taking these people out of the equation. And that's, like you say, I think we've learned a lot from those days. Where we are now, we're in a much, much better place. Is there still work to do? Absolutely, there is. There is. And I think we can all play our part in it, how we share those messages and how we reflect on the past. And stories like yours, fictional though it is, play their part in that, I think, by reminding us just how things used to be. Yeah. It gives us a little bit of a nudge of where we still need to go. So you mentioned there at the start as well that you were a journalist as well. And, a lot of that was to do with the LGBTQ plus communities and what have you. Correct me on that if I'm wrong. But it's, your work there was, well, you tell us about it in your own words.
Well, that was later. I was a musician from 1974 until 1988. In 1988, it was the peak of the AIDS epidemic. I was in an activist group called ACT UP, and we used to hold demonstrations to protest against drug companies that weren't researching or were gouging people if they did have drugs financially, or protest against the media, the New York Times, for failing to report, protest against the government for failing to provide services, et cetera. And I wanted to think of what else I could possibly do other than just going to demonstrations and things. And the idea popped into my head that I could found a magazine that would cover all of these issues. And so that is what I did. In 1989, I founded Outweek magazine. And because there was so much talent in that world of LGBTQ, AIDS activists, all of that in New York at that time, I was able to recruit a remarkable group of people, many of whom went on to stellar careers in journalism. But at the time, they were very young. It was their very first job at a magazine. And it just took off like a rocket and became a really significant, organ of the media, a sort of a must-read thing for several years. And in the course of that, I thought I would do it for a year or two, get it started, and then go back to music. But my life just took this other direction, and I became a writer and a journalist. And when the AIDS epidemic finally began to abate in the late 90s, it had now been 10 years. The music industry had changed beyond recognition. I was now much older, and the idea of going back to being a working musician just didn't make sense to me. So I just transitioned to becoming a television producer, primarily making documentaries for things like VH1 and MTV that used my musical background and my journalist background combined in this new way. And that's pretty much what I have done ever since.
It's a pretty exciting career, if you don't mind my saying, you know what I mean? To start off, I think everybody, when they first listen to things, like say when I first listened to Blondie and things like that, and obviously because I'm a middle-class white guy from England, of course I could totally relate to the hip-hop community, and that's the music that I listened to, in the early 80s. But, you have this idea when you listen to it, that's what I'm going to do when I grow up. That's what I'm going to do for a living. I want to be a musician. I want to be a writer. I want to be a journalist. I want to be an author. And, somehow life gets in the way and I ended up in retail. I'm not entirely sure how that happened. But to do those things is immensely exciting. It must be, you must look back with some very fond memories, much of which you were then able to use in your book, I hope.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it was very exciting and very fun. It wasn't easy, and you had to be willing to sacrifice the comforts that people, I think, especially in the beginning of your career when you're starting out, it's a long shot to make it in the music business. it's a long shot to make it in a lot of those kinds of artistic endeavors. If you want to be a writer, if you want to be a poet, good luck trying to make a living doing that. There has to be a lot of luck involved, which I did have a lot of luck. And another thing is you have to go to the place, you have to be willing to uproot yourself and go to the place where it's possible to do that. And in those days in the United States, there were really only a few places that you could actually, if you intended to have a serious musical career, I mean, you can make music anywhere you want, and people do. I now live in Connecticut, and there's music all over the place around here, but most people have some other job and they do music on the weekends or whatever. But if you really wanted to have an actual career as a recording artist or as a actual working musician, in those days it was New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, maybe Austin, Texas, and for country music, Nashville, Tennessee. And those were the places. So you had to go from wherever you came from to one of those places, and then where you didn't know anybody, and then just start trying to do it. And if you didn't have any money, if you were a kid, if you're 20, 21 years old, how do you do that? And I think that dissuades a lot of incredibly talented people from doing it, and of course today it's completely different. Now you can do it in your bedroom. I mean, with Logic and Pro Tools and GarageBand and things like that, you can literally do a Billie Eilish and sit in your bedroom and record hit albums. You don't have to be anywhere. But in those days, you really did have to be in one of those places. So that was difficult. And so it was fun, but it was a challenge. And of course, my family strongly disapproved of, what the hell do you think you're doing? I can't believe, that kind of thing. But in retrospect, you forget about the bad times and the difficulties, and you remember the good times. And there were lots and lots of good times and incredibly exciting moments and incredibly exciting people, because the kind of people that tended to do that tend to be a little bit larger than life. They're big personalities. I think of people like David Johansen, from the New York Dolls. These are wonderful, fabulous, interesting people. And of course, there's wonderful, fabulous, interesting people everywhere, but there was a concentration of them there that made life an adventure on almost any given day. You never knew what was going to happen.
Oh, that's incredible. So when you sat down to write this book, then obviously you had your inspiration, you're walking along. How did you go about taking yourself back to those days at the CBGB club? And how did you start by putting pen to paper? How fluid a process was it?
It was a really fun process. It really was. It was an immersive process. First of all, I had sort of diaries, didn't keep them constantly, but I had them from that era off and on, and my calendar books and stuff like that would just cause me to remember, oh, right. You'd remember people that you had almost forgotten when you started to immerse yourself. In addition, there are a number of really good books. Please Kill Me, a whole bunch of books about the punk movement, oral histories of the punk movement. I would call up my friends that are still around from that time, who have better memories than I do, and we would just talk for hours on the phone. People like Danny Fields, who was the manager of the Ramones, who's now in his mid-80s, but still, completely 100% upstairs. And we would talk about that. And then I lucked out. VH1, which I had worked for many years, made a 2-hour documentary some years ago that is now available on YouTube just for free for anybody to watch it, called 1977, The Coolest Year in Hell. It is a documentary, a 2-hour documentary about New York in 1977, the exact year of the book. And I was already writing the book when I stumbled upon it on YouTube, and it covers the blackout, it covers the Son of Sam, it covers CBGBs, it covers the World Series, what happened with the New York Yankees in that time. It covers the rise of hip hop, all that stuff. It's 2 hours long, and it's wall-to-wall archival footage of New York from that year that their archivists had collected. And I would just sit there and watch it and go, oh, right, I remember that. Things that you had just forgotten were in this documentary. and the way that people talked and the kinds of clothes that they were wearing, just the whole thing. So I would have that over in the corner, and whenever I wanted inspiration, I would just look at that and go, oh, right, I got to put something about that in the book too, because that was such a big part of what it was like to be there then. And I had almost completely forgotten it, but I remember it now. So I did all of those things and just immersed myself in it. And it has been very gratifying. I mean, as we just mentioned, I haven't yet heard from Patti Smith or Deborah Harry, but I've heard from a lot of people that were around then. And usually the first thing, I mean, people say, oh, it's a wonderful story, and I didn't guess who done it until the very end. And it really was a captivating, murder mystery. But the thing that really blows me away about it is how well you captured what it was like. I mean, I remember what it was like to be there because I was reading this book. Like on every page, I would sort of go, oh, right. Wow. So I'm very heartened by that response from people that actually were there. Makes me feel really good.
That's good. That's good. And have you had much feedback from other people, from readers? How long has the book been out now?
Came out in middle of December. So it's
yes.
a month and a half.
So it's a very, very new book. And obviously when we put this out on the audio, which is where most people find our podcast, we will share the links to that where they can buy the book. Like you say, I picked myself up a copy. You were very kind to send me an e-version, but I like to hold the book in my hand. And second of all, when people are good enough to come on the podcast and share their story, I think the least I can do is put my hand up.
Well, thank you very much.
No. It's the least we can do. Honestly, it's the least we can do. Now, this one is unread yet. I have some time off. I'm going on a cruise in August, and this is the book that I'm going to be taking with me.
Nice.
I'm hoping my children give me some peace to read it there. It's a big ask for those pair, trust me.
So you'll be on a cruise, and you'll be plunged back into the great blackout of 1977 and the people staggering around on the Bowery trying to get into CBGBs, and a murderer on the loose, who's starting to knock off the people on the downtown scene, and nobody knows why. But you'll find out why when you get to the end, and it's kind of a shock.
Amen. And I'm looking forward to it. I don't read an awful lot of fiction. I read a lot of factual books, but I really like the way that this is set in that era. That that was a New York City that I can remember growing up, looking over the pond. There wasn't I didn't visit New York, like I said, till 2005 for the first time. So very, very different now.
Yes, you would not. If you started to go to New York in the 2000s, it would be very, very hard to imagine what it was like then, just like it is for me, because I lived in New York until 98 and then moved to LA. But I go back to New York, and every time I go back, when you're used to a certain thing and then you go away from it and it changes, every time you see it again, you see it the way that it used to be, and it's kind of a shock. And I'm like that everywhere I go in New York. I'll turn the corner, and you're walking down the Bowery. The Bowery is now this beautiful street. There's outdoor cafes. There's expensive restaurants. There's grocery stores like Whole Foods, organic grocery stores. This was a street of just pure devastation in the 70s, and even before the 70s, the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. Pure devastation, just people lying dead in the gut. Unbelievable. And I turn the corner and I see it in my eye the way that it used to be. And I want to grab people on the street, like particularly young people, and sort of grab them and say, hey, do you have any idea what this used to look like? Because it's such a gigantic change. So, but there's certain things that have stayed the same. And one thing that blows my mind is William S. Burroughs, who wrote Naked Lunch and Junkie and a whole bunch of other books. He's considered to be the premier novelist of the Beat generation. And he was a major heroin user and a gun nut and all sorts of things like that. He lived on the Bowery. He had a loft on the Bowery in an old YMCA building from the 1880s that had just been turned into lofts. The YMCA had gotten rid of it at some point. And he lived in the men's locker room of the YMCA, which he called the bunker. And he held court there in the mid mid-70s, after he came back from his 20 years abroad. In the mid-70s, he held court there, and it was filled with his art and his furniture and crazy stuff. And if you were lucky enough, which I was, to be invited to dinner there sometime, it was like an unforgettable experience. Well, anyway, he moved out in the late 80s, in the late 70s, around 1980. He moved back to Kansas. He was by then becoming very old. And John Giorno, another famous poet from that same milieu who had a lot of money, took over Burroughs' loft and preserved it exactly as it was when Burroughs lived there. Exactly. He had an orgone box that he used to sit in. The orgone box is still there. His art is still on the walls. His furniture is still there. Everything. And it has been perfectly preserved. The bunker, that loft called the bunker, plays a major role in the book. And several major scenes in the book happen in the bunker. And I didn't realize that it had been preserved. And I was invited to an event there about 6 months ago. And I went, and it just blew my mind that this little piece of 1977, a piece of 1977 that is included in my book, is still exactly as it was back then, when everything else has changed. And they do events there. The John Giorno Poetry System, it's a foundation that John Giorno created to encourage people to do poetry and have poetry readings and all sorts of things like that. And they do readings there, and they do events in the bunker. So I'm going to do a reading there when the weather gets a little bit warmer. That's the logical place for me. Everybody says, well, you should do it at the Strand Bookstore. You should do it. And I'm like, no, I'm going to do it at the bunker, because where else can you go? I mean, CBGB's, by the way, is still there. But
Really?
No, well, the club itself is closed, but the building is still there. And it was turned into a very upscale clothing store, John Varvatos clothing store. And John Varvatos, very sort of upscale designer kind of clothing, but he also is a little bit punk rock. So he preserved the awning, but it says John Varvatos instead of CBGB's on it. And the inside has a very CBGB's vibe. And there's even a stage, a musical stage in the back with a little drum kit and a couple of amps that's kind of near where the stage actually used to be at CBGB's. So that if you're a tourist and you come to New York, you can walk into CBGB's, and even though a t-shirt will cost $300, it's that kind of a store, you can still be in the vibe, but it's nothing really like what CBGB's used to be like. And Max's Kansas City, which was the other great sort of punk rock club, is now a Korean deli. So you can go into Max's and stand where everybody from Andy Warhol to Bruce Springsteen used to hang out. And then you can buy a sandwich at the counter because you're in this loud, raucous Korean delicatessen. So it's like that. The places are still there, but they're different.
Oh, that's incredible. Like you say, that loft sounds like the perfect place to be, to be doing a reading there. Much more authentic and fabulous that there's a little bit of it still frozen there in time that you can go back and you can see.
What are the odds of that?
What are the odds? Yeah, it's good. It's good to see that there's somebody out there who appreciates the art that it came from.
Yeah.
So when you wrote this book, then obviously we know your inspiration as to why. What do you want people to take away from it? What are the takeaways? Is as well as being an enjoyable novel and something they can take some pleasure from reading, because there's a lot of pleasure to be had from reading.
Well, there's one thing. Yeah, there is one major thing that I'm sort of constrained to talk about because it's a spoiler. If you don't really understand why these people were murdered until you get to the end of the book. And when you get to the end of the book and you find out why they were murdered, it bears a very, very strong connection to everything that we were just talking about, which is basically gentrification and the destruction of the New York that made it possible for artists and young people and creative people to flock there, and turned it into a city basically reserved for millionaires. And, You'll find out when you get to the end of the book, but I can't give too many details about that because it's supposed to be a mystery, and that comes at the end of the book. But as far as what they would take away from it during reading most of the book, before you get to the actual resolution of the murder mystery, just what an exciting and creative and fun and fabulous time, and how people can make something good out of something bad, how people can live. We were often told that if you are disadvantaged, and if you live in a disadvantaged place, that you're a victim somehow, and that there's not much hope for you because you're living in this terrible situation. And this includes whether it's being very poor or living, in a war zone or disastrous place or whatever. And that is certainly true. There certainly have challenges, but you can make joy and be creative and have fun anywhere you find yourself, provided that you have it coming from inside. One thing that I remember, I have a very visceral memory of this. When I first moved to New York, I didn't have any money at all. My first apartment was actually $90 a month, and it was really a horrible pit. It was really a terrible, terrible place. And I only lived there for 6 months, and there were guns going off. I mean, I used to tell people that the most common telephone number that I would dial would be 911, because almost every night you would hear guns and you would call 911. There's shooting on Avenue B around 10th Street. There's guns going off, whatever. That's where I lived for the first 6 months. And I always knew that I was going to get out of there. I always knew that that was a temporary situation for me. I had gone to college. I came from a middle-class background. I was going to move to New York to try to become a musician, so I was going to have to live in a place like this for a while, but eventually I would be able to, rise above that, which happened for me very quickly. But I would look at my neighbors, the people that had lived there their whole lives, who were truly, it was mostly a Puerto Rican neighborhood in those days, maybe 20% Black and 70% Puerto Rican. And they had lived there their whole lives. And they did not have an expectation that things were going to get better for them. Do you know what I mean? It was like a different thing. Like we were both experiencing the same thing, but we were coming from it from, I guess you would today in the nomenclature of the progressives, we were coming from a different place of privilege. I was privileged because I was middle class and I was white and I was male. I was gay, so that was a disadvantage in those days, but otherwise I was pretty advantaged. My neighbors were not. But even amongst them, a lot of them ended up doing wonderful things and creative things. And in the circle of people around CBGBs, many of them came from very disadvantaged backgrounds. Many of them were people that had been thrown out of their houses, out of their family homes for being drug users or for being gay or lesbian or for being unconventional or whatever. And instead of moping around and feeling sorry for themselves and feeling disadvantaged, they found their way to New York and found their way to that scene and ended up becoming wonderful, fabulous, fascinating people. So that was what I was trying to convey in the first 2/3 of the book before we really get into the hardcore murder stuff, solving the murder, is just how much fun you can have if you give yourself a chance.
That's good. I mean, it's a great story as well. Almost the land of opportunity there as well. Like say, where you don't think that you're stuck with that. You're always going to move on to bigger and better things. So back then, the CBGB community, was it inclusive? For people like yourself. I certainly know in terms of sort of art, it's not uncommon. For the LGBTQ community to be a big part of that, and was it back the same back then, or was the areas more?
Yeah, it was quite inclusive. There was a gay subculture on the CBGB's scene. It wasn't the predominant scene. The predominant scene was very straight and heterosexual, but people didn't have any problem with it. I was originally introduced to CB's. The first time I went to CB's was to see Patti Smith, one of her first concerts there, and I was brought there by her keyboard player, who was one of my best friends, Richard Soule, who was gay. I mean, we had a little fling, and then we became really good friends. And he said, "Oh, I'm playing with this woman, Patti Smith, and we're playing on Thursday night at CBGB's. We wanted you to come to see it." So I was pulled into that scene by a gay person, and he was on the scene all the time, and there were quite a number of gay people, and many of the characters in the book. I mean, I wouldn't say that the CBGB's Conspiracy is a gay book by any stretch of the imagination, but a couple of the main characters are gay, and they're very much on that scene, and they're very respected. I never had any. I never had any. I think any bad things. I think the hardcore scene that evolved later in the early '80s. There was a hardcore matinee, and this was really the origin of hardcore. That was somewhat different, and that I think was because it was a more violent scene. There, you would very rarely see fights at CBGBs. Like you go to a bar on a Saturday night and a fight will break out and there's a bouncer to stop the fight. That didn't really happen at CBGBs very often. It was not a violent crowd. The pose was sort of an angry, violent, nihilistic, God bless the Queen, she ain't no human being, kind of pose. But the people themselves were more sort of art school dropouts than they were actually Hell's Angel violent people. But the hardcore scene that evolved later had a significant amount of violence and homophobia. And so I wouldn't really go there. It was a hardcore matinee because you don't want to take any chances that you're getting a tooth knocked out. But yeah, it was inclusive. It was also somewhat racially inclusive. I mean, it was primarily a white scene, but there were lots of people of color and Puerto Ricans and Black people in New York. The Latino community then was largely Puerto Rican and Dominican. And so it was pretty inclusive. And that was one of the things that made it fresh, and anybody could join. You just basically had to be a misfit. If you didn't fit in any place else, you fit in at CB's because everybody fit in at CB's.
Ah, that's awesome. Yeah, there's a little bit of me that would have liked to visit that place back in the day, although I probably was just a little bit too young. But still, nonetheless, it does seem like somewhere I'll get to visit when I read the book is probably the best way of thinking about it.
Yes, well, the best way to think about it back then. But CB stayed in business until 2003, just before you got there in 2005. I think it closed in 2000. I can't remember the year, 2003 or 2004, and it was put out of business by gentrification, by the landlord. CB's, because it was all flop houses on the Bowery. There was a flop house above CBGB's. I mean, it was in a building where Hilly had the ground floor. It was this club. And then the people upstairs it was the Bowery bums, kind of thing. And then eventually whoever owned that, I think it was some sort of social services organization, the kind of groups that, try to help people that are in that situation. They sold it to somebody who wanted to gentrify it and jack up the rent. And Hilly couldn't afford the rent. And so he was forced to close it. Otherwise, it would probably still be in business.
Yeah, that would be nice. Wow. Oh, well, I'd certainly something I'm going to look into a little bit more. Like I say, I shall enjoy your book, but it wasn't something I'd heard of before, if I'm really honest. But it was something I will definitely find out a bit more. And I shall certainly try and find that VH1 documentary. So musically then, just before we let you go, because we're all coming up to around about the hour mark. What were the bands that you played with? What were the instrument you played in? And is there anything that we may be familiar with that you could have played on?
I was a keyboard player. I was mostly a live performer. I was a musical director for people like Ronnie Spector and Darlene Love. I did a lot of R&B with people like Rufus Thomas and Solomon Burke, who was the sort of original inspiration for the Rolling Stones. I had a series of live shows. I became sort of a impresario, I guess you would call it, and did these shows called the Downtown Dukes and Divas in these very large discotheques that basically hold 2,000, 3,000 people. and my shows were the big shows that they would do. So I was mostly a live performer, a musical director, a keyboard player, because I had the ability to write musical charts, because I was classically trained musician, and most of my friends didn't know how to do that. So I had this sort of weird little superpower that allowed me to put projects together for people, write the charts, run the rehearsals, get them off the ground. And I did that for a lot of people. And I even did for people like Patti Smith and Tom Verlaine. You know those songbooks that you can buy that you can play the music on the piano and, songbook. So when people on that scene would do those kinds of things, they would ask me to actually, like Patti Smith's book for the first two albums are songbooks, and I did those songbooks because she would then get to have direct control over it. I would play it and she would say, don't do it like that, do it like this instead, whatever. So I did all sorts of jobs like that. And I just went from one thing to another and had a fabulous time.
Yeah, it certainly sounds like it. It certainly sounds like it. So can we find any of the music, any of the stuff that you played in on YouTube?
Oh, yes. If you just Google my name on YouTube, there was a guy, it's mostly though from the 80s, not from the 70s, because video cameras weren't really around in the 70s, not commercial, not personal video cameras. They came in the early mid 80s, and there was this wonderful guy, very good friend of mine named Nelson Sullivan, who went out every single night and videotaped everything that was going on in the downtown scene. And he came to everything that I did, to all of my shows, and videotaped them from backstage before, then the show, and then backstage after. And he passed away in 1990, but all of his stuff has been digitized. There's a foundation that has digitized all of his stuff because it's considered to be a priceless relic of the downtown New York scene. And much of it is on YouTube, and I'm all over those things. So if you just Google my name and go into YouTube, you'll see a lot. Yeah.
Fabulous. That's something for our listeners to do as well after they've listened to this episode. So, Gabe, I want to thank you very much for spending this time with us and sharing all these stories of New York City back in the day, and of course of the book that you've written about it. So just for our listeners, tell us a little bit about the book, where you can find it, in which bookstores you'll find it in the US, and we'll share a link to it where you can purchase it in the UK.
I mean, the main place is Amazon, of course. That is where I didn't realize this. I thought that bookstores were still where most people bought books, but apparently, according to my publisher, it's almost 90% of books are purchased on Amazon or barnesandnoble.com. And so most people, as the easiest way to buy it, you can buy it in a bookstore, but the easiest way is just go on Amazon and or support your local bookstore by going down to the local bookstore.
Amen. Yeah, that's important that we keep those guys going as well. So yeah, like you say, I picked up my book, and ashamed to say I picked it up from Amazon because it's just easier, and I got it delivered the next day.
It is easier. And if you do buy it on Amazon and you like it, then go back on Amazon and give it a little rating. People are always saying with podcasts, give us a star, give us a rating, give us a like. Same thing with books. Give it a little star, write a couple of sentences if you want to about it. That always helps. But by all means, buy it in bookstores. I mean, local bookstores, particularly small bookstores, deserve all the help and support that they can get.
Amen. Yeah, 100%. And once I've read the book, I can promise you this: I will go and leave you a review, positive one. I'm not mean. It will be a good review, I promise. So, Gabe, thank you very much for spending this time with us. I've really enjoyed listening to your stories, and I'm really looking forward to reading your book. So, thank you for sharing this time with us.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. It's a great show, great podcast, and I love it. So, keep on keeping on.
We will. We will. Thank you very much.
All right. Take care. Bye.
Friends around the mic, kicking back. All right. Day turns into night, podcast in the spotlight. Sipping on that brew, talking all